that warm introduction, and thank you all for welcoming me here today. I really look forward to our conversation, and I'll be staying through the end of the talking time, so what we can't get in with my speaking, we can have a more casual talk about later. I'm going to talk today about the ideas in a book I wrote a few years ago. This book, Ain't No Trust, a very long subtitle, How Bosses, Boyfriends, and Bureaucrats Fail Low-Income Mothers and Why It Matters. There's sort of a funny story about how I ended up with that subtitle that I can tell you later. But before I dive into the book and the argument in it, I just want to talk a little bit about how I came to write it. We are here in Philadelphia today, and you know that this is a city with great riches of history and culture and natural beauty, but it's also a city with a great deal of poverty. In fact, it has the highest poverty rate of any of the top 10 biggest cities. Not the highest poverty rate in the country. Camden, right across our river, has a higher poverty rate. But for the top 10 big cities, it has the highest rate. And worse yet, it has the highest deep poverty rate, which means people living below half the poverty line. So right now, for a single parent with 2 children, which is a fairly typical family size for a family in poverty, the poverty line is currently just under $21,000 a year. So someone living in deep poverty has an income of less than about $10,500 a year. So obviously that is very difficult to live on, especially in a big northeastern city. Well, much of my work on poverty was conducted in Chicago, which was my home for 18 years. I first started thinking about poverty here in Philadelphia a long time ago. When I was a kid growing up in Ardmore, just west of the city, I would often drive into the city with my family along Lancaster Avenue, and when the car would pass over City Ave, which at that time was called City Line Avenue, that's how you know when someone is a transplant here and has lived here a long time, whether they call it City Line Avenue or City Avenue. There was soon a change in the scenery from affluence to poverty. And the differences in the living conditions were so abrupt that as a child I simply couldn't understand it. I couldn't understand how in America poverty could exist at all, never mind within a mile or two of solidly middle class, upper middle class, and even wealthy neighborhoods. I don't think as an adult I really understand it any better, but I certainly know a lot more about it and about the social forces that support it. Perhaps in part because of these childhood observations about inequality, I ended up majoring in sociology in college and continued to get a PhD in the field. When I was in grad school, it was the mid-1990s, and welfare reform was being hotly debated at the time, as ending welfare as we know it was one of Bill Clinton's main campaign promises. It was something actually one of his speechwriters came up with at midnight before a speech, and he said it, and then his polling numbers showed it was one of the most popular things he ever said. And so it became a real centerpiece of the campaign. It came along with this other catchphrase, 2 years and you're off. And that struck me and many other people as very strange, because if you read the literature on welfare usage, you actually knew that most people who took up welfare benefits actually left the welfare rolls within 2 years without a policy making them do it. So this whole kind of welfare as a way of life concept was a stereotype that the data did not back up. But I also learned that those exits from welfare were often short-lived, and often people did return back to the welfare rolls. Now, all these findings that I'm talking about come from quantitative analyses of administrative data. The states have, data on people entering and exiting welfare rolls. So it's impossible from that kind of data to know what the people who were signing up for welfare and leaving welfare and sometimes coming back to welfare, what they were doing, thinking, experiencing, feeling, what their lives were really like. In order to know that, you had to actually meet those people and ask them about their lives. And so for my dissertation, I set out to do that, and I interviewed women, most recipients of the main, what we think of as welfare. There's lots of programs like maybe Social Security benefits that we might call welfare, but most people think of public assistance for low-income families as welfare. And most of those recipients are women because it's only for families with children, and women tend to be the custodial parents of children. So I interviewed women who were currently receiving or had a history of receiving the benefits from the program at the time, which was called Aid to Families with Dependent Children, or AFDC. After welfare reform, it changed its name to Temporary Assistance to Needy Families. So that temporary was right front and center to communicate the new philosophy that welfare receipts should be temporary. My goal in these interviews was to understand how people left welfare and why so many people returned, and that's what I wrote the dissertation about. And then I moved on to other work, and I wrote a good bit on adolescent parenthood and its effects, and on some other poverty-related subjects. I also wrote on gender inequality in the labor market, particularly I did a sort of ethnographic piece on women in factory work, which is in keeping with this month and with what Betsy talked about. But 10 years later, fast forward, after welfare reform was passed and the policies were fully entrenched, I became interested in how women like those I had interviewed 10 years before were now faring in this very different policy regime. And so I set out to interview a new group of women who, like the earlier group of women, were raising children in poverty and who had a history of welfare usage. That first group was probably no longer eligible for welfare because many of their kids had aged out of eligibility age. That happens at 18. So to prepare for this new set of interviews, I reread all of my previous interviews. And I saw something in them I hadn't really fully seen before. It's interesting how you need some distance sometimes to see things. And I suddenly realized that there was a glaringly strong theme that cut across almost all of the women who I interviewed the first time around, and all of the subjects I talked with them. I just sort of couldn't believe it. It just kept coming up and coming up and coming up. And that theme was the women's intense feelings of distrust. Distrust in their welfare caseworkers, in their bosses, in their child care providers, in their boyfriends or husbands, and sometimes even in their close family friends close family and friends, even though that was the group that they trusted the most. And this distrust seemed to lay behind a lot of the choices that they made. And so, as I interviewed the new set of women, I shifted the focus of my inquiry from this kind of moving on and off the welfare rolls thing to the role of trust and distrust in the women's lives. And these two sets of interviews together became the basis for the book, Ain't No Trust. And that's a quote that one of the women said in an interview. In the later interviews, I was interested to see whether distrust still guided the women's choices, even under this new policy regime, which exacted much higher penalties for making some of those choices, particularly for leaving jobs or being out of the labor market. Welfare reform did many things, and we can talk about more of what it did later if you want. But most relevant here is that it created a 5-year lifetime limit on welfare receipt. That limit did not exist before. And that's, over the whole lifetime. So if you're on for a year here, or 2 years later here, that all adds up and counts towards the 5 years. And it instituted work requirements for benefit receipt, work for pay. And it also ended the federal entitlement to receive welfare benefits. That entitlement had been set up by Roosevelt with the Social Security Act of 1935. So there was a lot of rhetoric about welfare reform undoing 60 years of social welfare policy history, and that's kind of a particular part, that end of the entitlement is what people are talking about. So under this new regime, the pressure to remain employed is enormous. What I found in the interviews somewhat surprised me. Not only did the women 10 years later sound almost exactly the same as the earlier women in the pervasiveness of their distrust. That part didn't surprise me. But they made similar choices based on their distrust. Before welfare reform, women who didn't trust employers, for example, simply quit their jobs, often without a lot of, talking to the employer or trying to work things out, knowing that they could return to welfare if they needed in the pre-reform era. Under the new policy era, post-reform, quitting a job is much riskier. Because if you have to return to welfare, every single month that you're back on, that clock is ticking towards your 5-year lifetime limit. So you really want to save those months for utter crises. So you might think that people wouldn't act on their distrust of employers in the same way, and yet they did. They were just as likely to quit due to distrust in a boss. In fact, in both time periods, the number one reason that women lost their jobs was pregnancy. And in low-wage work, it's almost impossible to keep a job if you become pregnant because there is no maternity leave. And so kind of maternity leave is leaving a job and then finding a new job when you're, a month later, say, when you're, can imagine going back to work. Sometimes 2 weeks later. So similarly, women before and after reform disregarded what their caseworkers told them about various policy incentives because they simply didn't believe what their caseworkers were saying. So let me illustrate this by telling you about one of the women I interviewed post-welfare reform. Her name was Flor Romero, although her name wasn't actually Flor Romero because I've changed all the names and gave people pseudonyms. She was, at the time, a 28-year-old mother who was separated from her husband. She had 2 young daughters, and she was having a really hard time finding a job that would pay her enough to get by in Chicago, where I met her. She had been, until somewhat recently, been working in a dollar store in Texas where she was living. And she was making $10 an hour, which was a really high wage amongst the group of women I interviewed. If you do the math, full-time, $10 an hour, it's not a lot of money for a yearly income, but it was high for this group. Her mother was 48 years old at the time, had diabetes and got very sick. And her father called her up and said, if you want to see your mother again, I think you've got to come. And she hadn't seen her mother in I think 2 years because travel was expensive. And she went and she talked to her boss, and her boss said, if you leave town right now, don't expect your job to be here when you get back. And she made the decision that she had to go see her mother, and she went to see her mother, and her mother died 10 days later, so she was very glad she had gone to see her mother. But when she got back to Texas, her boss was trustworthy in a sense that her boss kept her word, and she fired her. Flor did find another job, but a year later her marriage ended. And she decided to move back to Chicago to be near her father, to help him out, and he could help out with the girls. But for some reason, she found it much harder to find a job in Chicago. And after a few months, of not being able to find something, she went and applied for TANF, this newly named welfare program. And her caseworker said that she should take any job she can get, no matter what it pays, because in Illinois at the time, there was a program called Work Pays. And instead of, without this Work Pays, the federal rules were every dollar you make in the labor market, $1 was taken off of your welfare grant, if you were a welfare recipient. So there's kind of no financial incentive to work. And the state of Illinois thought this was problematic, and they applied for a federal waiver to run this new program, Work Pays, which they started running actually a few years before welfare reform and have run it ever since. And Work Pays reduces the welfare grant by only $1 for every $4 you earn. So you keep 3 out of 4. So there's this work incentive. So you always will have more money working than not working, at least in theory. Okay? But Flor was not buying it. She said, they talk about, okay, if you get a job, They say, like, out of every $3 you make, they cut off $1 of what your cash is. Let me just pause to say she has that slightly wrong because it's $4, not $3, but she understands this policy way better than almost anyone else I interviewed, which indicates that there's a big problem of communication between caseworkers and recipients, and I'll mention that again later because that's very problematic. So Flora goes on to say, so that sounds good, but in reality we all know they ain't going to do that. You know, they lie. So I said, they lie? What are they going to do? And she said, they're going to cut you off completely. The second they know you're working, they cut you off completely. So Flora knew she faced time limits and work requirements, and hence it was problematic that she was on the welfare rolls. But before these kicked in, Flora just considered it too risky to take a job that would leave her unable to feed and care for her children because she just didn't trust that the promised work supports would be there. And because she didn't trust they would be there, these policies that were carefully designed in the State House in Springfield, Illinois, to create incentives for low-wage women to find a job, low-income women to find a job, were completely undermined by distrust and by the history of the relationships between women and their caseworkers. Like Flora, women at both time periods distrusted their caseworkers, and their distrust in caseworkers seems to stem in part from the kinds of interactions they reported having with caseworkers. And let me just pause and say, I think it's really hard to be a caseworker. I think it became increasingly hard to be a caseworker post-welfare reform, because before reform, caseworkers cut checks. And after welfare reform, they were expected to be sort of full case management social workers to deal with issues that are very complicated: domestic violence, lack of job skills, housing problems, all sorts of problems, substance abuse issues. And they were not prepared to do this, and they were not given the resources or the pay or the small caseloads needed to do this well. And so caseworkers are sort of vilified, but it's not about them as people. It's about the structural situation they find themselves in, where it's almost impossible to be another way. So many of the women describe really difficult interactions with caseworkers, very abrupt interactional styles. I've sort of witnessed this myself, hanging out in welfare offices. This failure to communicate rules clearly, which the fact that Flora had that rule a little wrong, and many women didn't understand that rule at all. So of course it's not going to have its incentive effect if no one knows that it exists. And almost more importantly, a failure to deliver benefits. So when people do understand the rule, they feel like the rules aren't followed from the other side. So just to give you a flavor of these interactions, I talked with Julie Callahan, who was a 23-year-old mother of 2 children. She had just reapplied for TANF, again, that welfare program, after the birth of her second child. She had a 1-month-old baby at this point. And I kind of talked to her for several months as she was getting onto the welfare rolls, because it's kind of a process. It's not like you show up and they just give it to you. It's hard work to get yourself eligible for these benefits. So after her first meeting with her caseworker, I asked her how it went. And she said, it was a big problem. The caseworker, Ms. Driscoll, was very mean, and she was very disrespectful. She said she doesn't care what happens because she retires in 10 years. She's tired of young women coming in here asking her for welfare. And she also went on to say that Ms. Driscoll said, why are you here again? Because she had been on 5 years earlier. And she goes, oh, right, you had another kid. So this kind of sort of judgmental behavior. So it's through this background of hostile relations in which caseworkers must communicate these policy incentives to their caseload. And it leads to sort of an atmosphere of distrust, right? If someone's sort of interacting with you in that way, you're not going to necessarily trust them, right? And a lot of these women's distrust comes from the distrust that's placed in them. So at both time periods, women, they trusted that anything that felt like a stick, anything that was going to make them do something, they trusted that would happen. But anything that was a carrot to entice them to do something, like this work pays program, which is hey, if you go to work, you'll get to keep more of your welfare grant. They didn't believe that at all. So we have the example of floor and not believing that's going to happen. So I asked a woman named Bernice Alexander about the work pays program. And I was really interested in what she was going to say, because Bernice was she was a really capable woman. She was really bright. She had a very strong work history. She did a lot of research on things and understood things. And so I thought, if Bernice doesn't know about this or doesn't believe in it, that's really telling. So she said, I read about work pays in the paper, and when I called them, of course it's like, are you from Mars? It's like they put out this stuff, and when you call and request it, oh, you don't qualify for that. Now, I hear so much of that. You don't qualify for that. I'm sorry. Like, I just wanted you to get the paper, meaning like a flyer advertising it. I didn't actually want you to call and request this. So it's like that. That's something that they put out to get you to make that move, meaning to get into the labor market, but they can't make it up once you need that help. So she has this very distrustful, very cynical view of what's going to happen. So this brings us to why I argue that distrust matters. You might be saying, okay, so there's a lot of distrust. Well, that's a shame, but does it really matter? And I believe it matters for two reasons. The first I've kind of been talking about, and that is that distrust makes policy goals harder to achieve. The goals of welfare policy were to get people to be employed, to get people to use child care to support their employment, to get people to get married, to get fathers involved with children, to get people to rely on their family rather than government for support, and to get people to temporarily use cash assistance. And what I argue in the book, kind of point by point, is that distrust makes each of these things less likely to happen. I kind of walked through the work pays example as an illustration, and I don't have time to kind of talk about the others in detail, but I'm happy to talk about it later. And there's kind of a chapter on each thing in the book. And some of it's really heartbreaking, I would say, particularly the distrust in child care providers and people's experience with child care providers who have hurt their children. Sometimes in psychic ways or maybe even minor ways, and sometimes in very serious ways. Children can get burns and come up with nuts on their heads and things like that. The second reason I think distrust really matters is that it's a form of inequality. We tend to think people who are trusting are suckers, like there's kind of that attitude, but trust is actually a really valuable thing. And the middle class and upper middle class and wealthy reap its rewards all the time. And one, Francis Fukuyama, who's a scholar of trust, talks about trust as a lubricant for social action. It kind of makes everything happen more smoothly. Banking practices, mortgage practices, although in problematic ways, as we learned in 2007, business practices, lots of things run on trust. And the operation of social networks, that you know that your neighbor is going to take your kid and it's going to be okay. If you can trust people, that's really, really helpful. But trust is in very short supply for the least advantaged among us. There's sort of this conundrum, right? Low-income women need the benefits of trust the most, and yet they trust the least. And why is that? And the trust literature sort of helps us understand that. There is a whole big theoretical literature on trust, which I went down a rabbit hole trying to figure out. It's very complicated, but ultimately interesting. And trust really has structural roots. It really has to do with the social context that you find yourself in. And there are lots of things that promote trust or promote distrust. But two really important ones that are relevant here are when people feel that they share interests with the person that they're interacting with or the institution that they're interacting with, and when people people feel that they have the power to make others accountable to them. Low-income mothers have neither of those things. They're often at total odds in terms of interests. Welfare mothers, low-income mothers need welfare benefits. They go to welfare offices hoping to get help. Caseworkers are under enormous pressure by state governments to deny and to cut off. And so their interests are almost diametrically opposed. Now, many individual caseworkers have gone into this because they're really good-hearted people and they really want to help people. But they're still in this structure where that's not what it's about. So they have opposite interests. And I can march through sort of the other areas where people have opposite interests. And low-income others have very little power to make others accountable to them. They have very little political voice. They have very little say in state governments. They have very little power in welfare offices, in workplaces where employers see low-income workers as sometimes people talk about like Dixie cups that you take one, you can throw it out, you can take another one. And so that gives you very little power as a worker, especially in this post-union power era that we live in. So this is like a perfect recipe for distrust. So it's not like there's something wrong with low-income women. It's not like it's a personality defect that they're not trusting. It's that they're in a context in which it does not promote trust. Can I just check in on? I forgot to look at the time when I started. How much more would you like me to speak? I can. Okay, so a few more minutes? 5 minutes. Okay, that'll work. Okay, so a lot of women. Well, let me just back up and say Russell Hardin is one of the key trust theorists, and he has this great quote which I love and I find so useful. And his quote is, "Trust is functional in a world in which trust pays off. Distrust is functional in a world in which trust does not pay off." And what's going on here is that the women I interviewed have concluded that distrust is functional. And they might be right. In many occasions, sometimes they were initially trusting and they got burned. And then they learned to distrust. Trust and distrust are learned through experience. And they have learned that distrust is functional. And the difference between them and people who are better off financially is that often for middle-class people, trust is functional. Okay, so this is not an argument about fixing the mothers. This is an argument about fixing the environment so that they're in a more trustworthy environment, and trustworthiness breeds trust. So there's lots of things I think we could do to make the environment more trustworthy, and maybe we can talk about those things in our discussion time. There's like a lot of specific policy changes we could make. But let me just say sort of more big picture. This is kind of a squishy concept, trust. And a lot of policymakers don't deal in squishy concepts. So they sort of, don't see the importance of this. But I sort of think talking about trust is a luxury, especially, we're coming out of the economic crisis now, but especially in times of economic crises, state governments were, frantically trying to stay afloat, and they can't do things like worry about trust. But I think there are two really important reasons that we should not disregard this issue. One is that distrust blocks the very actions that policymakers are trying to promote. And the second is that distrust is a potent form of inequality. Those two reasons I said earlier for why trust matters. So the wage gap produces a trust gap with important consequences. And I really think we need to think a lot about it. It's funny, you write a book and you think it's done, but the ideas kind of keep going on and you keep thinking about how they apply. And so I thought a lot about trust and distrust through the 2016 election. And I think trust issues were all over that election for voters of kind of on every side of the political spectrum. And you can really look at it through a lens of distrust. There's a distrust of Washington and politicians, Hillary Clinton as representative of those, that kind of Washington establishment. The white working class felt like the government were not sharing their interests and felt that the government judged them, that through a sense of elitism. There was low voter turnout amongst African Americans and low-income people, again, because this feeling of lack of shared interests, feeling used, that campaign promises don't translate into action, feeling that sort of the history of racism and mass incarceration and police brutality, that those issues have not been addressed in any kind of sincere and authentic way. So, as we move forward, unifying the country, I see as a matter of rebuilding trust across the political spectrum. And that's certainly not easy, given that so many groups feel that their interests are at odds with each other. But I do think it's the only way that we can move forward for either political party. And I think that's what the challenge that lays before us. So I'll stop there and we can talk more later.